Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
Why would these different peoples in Middle-earth accept the deception of receiving rings from Sauron in disguise? People don't make devil's bargains because they're stupid. You know what I mean?
They make them because they're desperate.
We wanted him to come into the narrative in an unexpected way. Because if you sort of think about the sort of obvious way, it's like, okay, a tall, mysterious, beautiful demigod named Anatar shows up and says, let me help you with all your problems by making you some rings.
Who's going to fall for that?
Your new retconned version of Galadriel essentially did, by inadvertently putting every measure in place to ensure Sauron's return to Middle-earth, when in the books she never trusted Anatar from the very beginning. Not to mention that the source material in the films actually do provide context for why the other races accepted the rings.
9 rings were gifted to the race of men, who above all else desire power.
Your inability to comprehend such a painfully basic premise is not the dunk on Tolkien that you think it is, regardless of how proud you are for pissing on another person's life work and legacy. That's right, we're back with some grade A rings of cringe. No lengthy intros this time either. The levels of stupid get dialed up to 11 for the rest of this show, which means we're going to have plenty to talk about. So let's go ahead and dive straight back in. Now, where did I last leave off? Oh right, Blind Legolas. He is technically a main character in this series, I guess. Anyways, we discovered that he's been tossed into a labor camp with the rest of his buddies from the first episode. Now you more than likely already have a fair number of questions, such as how exactly did the rest of Rondir's detachment get captured? Did the Orcs somehow manage to take their heavily fortified watchtower? If so, then why the hell would they abandon such an extremely strategic resource? And why is it that none of the elves in their watchtowers ever noticed the large, desolate, smoldering wasteland of dead trees with their elf vision?
These passages reach all the way to Horden. This must be how they escaped our detection.
That is without a doubt the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You are a fucking idiot.
Avoid your detection? How exactly? This massive trench stretches on for miles. The Orcs have been taking part in the mass deforestation of the entire region that you all were supposed to keep watch over. Nothing about this is even remotely subtle, but I guess elves are rather selective when it comes to their raging boners they have for trees.
Felling a tree will slow our progress. We shall go around.
Rip the whole stinking tree down!
What are you talking about? Just go around. There apparently was never an issue with doing that when digging the rest of the trench. Not that you had ample time or opportunity to spot the tree in advance, it was only just sitting out here in the middle of the open amidst all the other ones that got burnt down or uprooted. And all of this then begs the question of why in the absolute hell the Orcs are even doing this in the first place. Yes, they're afraid of the sun and are somewhat weakened by it, but they aren't vampires. It's not like they're physically unable to travel around during daytime. Plus, from what I can tell, the Orcs mainly conduct all their raids on settlements during the night anyways. Having them dig this massive trench is beyond impractical and really only exists in the plot to reinforce an unnecessary change to the lore. But don't worry, it's not like the show ever gets wildly inconsistent with this new standard. Still, Blind Legolas somehow manages to cut down this tree despite using what has to be the world's shittiest axe, where shortly afterwards the rest of the elves devise an escape plan, which essentially just involves a glorified game of tug-of-war and for these randos to hit at the ground like a bunch of window-licking troglodytes. Now, Blind Legolas should already be aware at this point that this attempt isn't going to work, due to A, all of the Orcs being alerted that they're attempting to escape, and B, that he has personally seen just how long it would take to make it to the nearest tree line. And the sad thing is, I was actually about to massively fault the Orcs for not recognizing the possibility of their slave labor using the blunt heavy tools they've been given as weapons, until I realized that the combined intelligence of these elves and humans still wouldn't outscore the tree they were ordered to cut down. Just to be clear, this is definitely not a ringing endorsement for the Orcs' competency, because both groups are really competing as to who can outstupid the other. Which naturally brings us to the next problem on the list. So instead of the Orcs trying to use brute strength to get all the slaves back in line, they decide to unleash Curse Sonic 2.0 to kill off some of their workforce. The only way I could see this making sense is if the Orcs were wildly outnumbered and used the warg as an absolute last resort. But as far as we can tell, that most certainly isn't the case, and they still definitely have the means to cover themselves up to avoid being burned by the sun. So the only explanation I can come up with for why they take such a needlessly extreme measure is because the creative leads really wanted a warg scene. Though once again, through sheer dumb luck, Blind Legolas is able to take it down, giving our Weasley Watchwarden a chance to escape. because apparently not a single orc could have been even remotely bothered to stop him from killing off one of their trained warhounds. Standing around and doing nothing is basically their trademark at this point. Either way, we are then presented with a truly gut-wrenching moment. Oh no, not the Watch Warden. He had so many standout and endearing moments. Like that one time when he was super racist.
But the men who live here have not. The blood of those who stood with Morgoth still darkens their veins.
Yeah, actually, fuck that guy. It's a really tough sell to ask viewers to be invested in a rando, non-canon side character that'll only be remembered for abandoning one of his subordinates to get eaten by a warg. And copy-pasting Boromir's death onto him won't change that. However, with blind Legolas under the knife, he's then brought before the orcs' leader, Adar. The writers constantly try to pass him off as a nuanced character, but in all reality, he's just confusing. During their conversation, he makes the galaxy-brain decision to let blind Legolas go and deliver a message to the civilians held up in Ostirith. If the villagers pledge fealty to him and forsake all claims to their lands, then their lives will be spared. Now, the message part isn't necessarily the issue here, it's the whole releasing blind Legolas to deliver it part that really tosses a massive wrench into the narrative, because as it was brought up earlier in the show,
If even one of us makes it home, we can return in force and sweep the enemy from these lands like salt from a table.
and Adar would obviously have to be aware of this, because one of the main reasons for digging this massive trench in the first place was to avoid the elves' detection. Though that's basically the real-world equivalent of driving a bulldozer into a Best Buy and holding out hope that you don't break any of the merchandise. Still, the point is, letting blind Legolas go is astronomically stupid, because it could undermine his entire conquest for the Southlands and result with his legion of orcs getting absolutely decimated. But this show relies on something I like to call selective amnesia. Major plot beats will pop up in one episode, only to get completely dropped in another, because otherwise it would prove problematic with what the script is currently trying to establish. If either one of them had actually remembered this rather crucial tidbit of information, their interaction, along with its respective outcome, would play out much, much differently. Regardless, while all of this is going on, we then cut away to all of the villagers over at Ostirith. It turns out that the influx of refugees from the other remaining settlements has created a bit of a food crisis. For some reason, this was never a potential issue taken into consideration when coordinating the mass exodus of the remaining Southlanders towards this outpost.
Good job.
But there's no need for panic, because Bronwyn is now the new self-appointed leader, and she's ready to solve all of their problems.
Who gave you the right to decide?
Everyone who decided to come to this tower, Waldrick, including you.
What do we eat?
Find a way.
How?
I don't know.
Well, no fucking shit.
Fantastic. Really glad you're leading the charge on this one. It'd really be a shame if your son were to put his 2 functioning brain cells on full display and totally steal your thunder.
What's about Waldrick's root cellar? We send a small party into town. By day, when the orcs are fewer, they'll never even know we were there.
Yes, what about Waldrick's root cellar? It's strange that this is just now popping up in conversation, when it realistically should have been the first place to have been scavenged before abandoning the village. The bar is effectively their town center and where everyone goes to hang out all day when they aren't pressed with the looming threat of an orc invasion. The only reason I can think of for why Waldrick would have refused to bring any of that food here is because he's later revealed to be evil! But that still doesn't account for why he'd blatantly act against his self-interest. Unless he somehow knew about the orc attack and Adar's offer well in advance, which can't be the case because otherwise Waldrick wouldn't have been completely blindsided when discovering that Adar isn't Sauron.
You are Sauron, are you not? His name is John C.
But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, these are the stakes our characters are faced with, despite how utterly moronic this entire setup is. But against his mother's wishes, Theo takes the initiative to actually do something to solve their problem, so he drags the racist dude from episode 1 with him to go retrieve what's left from Waldrick's root cellar. Oh, and I neglected to mention that Theo found an evil Sauron sword a couple of episodes back. That may not seem like much right now, but it will become extraordinarily significant as we progress further in the show. Now, I cannot emphasize enough that this show is bad at establishing conflict. I mean, really, really bad. As in randomly tossing an orc encounter at Theo while he's scavenging Waldrick's bar during the middle of the day levels of bad. This scene ultimately wants to accomplish 2 things: to incorporate an element of tension as a means of highlighting Theo's bravery/selfishness, and to reveal the location of the secret weapon that the orcs have been searching for. However, all of this heavily relies on the orcs being capable of traveling around in daylight unhindered, which completely diminishes the entire point of digging this massive trench.
This must be how they escaped our detection, and how they shield themselves from sunlight.
Selective amnesia has once again reared its foul, decrepit face, fundamentally shattering the overall world building of the Mordor plotline. This stark break in continuity is the result of a blatant lore change that simply didn't need altering to begin with. Either way, Theo is forced to hide away in the village well and wait until nightfall to make his escape. Though the specifics of his escape will have to be put on the back burner for the time being, because we then cut away to Elrond, convening with Celebrimbor.
Elves and dwarves working together. Remarkable.
It really isn't actually, not by your standards at least. Hell, in episode 2 you assumed that the dwarves would welcome you with open arms and accept your proposal on face value solely because of your friendship with Durin. Not that any of this is supported by the fact that the joint construction of the forge that will create the elven rings of power is merely just treated as window dressing.
Elves and dwarves working together. Remarkable.
I have to say, the show is doing a fantastic job of filling in the gaps. However, those of you watching might be confused as to how progress on the tower is already this far along. When we were last with Brick and not Sauron, they hadn't even hit the 3-day threshold to hear from the Númenóreans whether they'd be granted passage back to Middle-earth. The baseline assumption that I and many other people had was that all these different subplots were all running concurrently, eventually converging with one another to address one overarching narrative. But this scene is one of many examples which breaks that structure entirely. To say that the passing of time in this show is a disjointed mess is a massive understatement. During their conversation, though, Celebrimbor suggests to Elrond that he believes Durin is either avoiding him or hiding something. This baseless assumption is enough to incentivize Elrond to arrive at Khazad-dûm and interrogate Disa in her home about where Durin is and what he's doing, eavesdrop on their conversation shortly afterward, and sneak off towards the tunnel that leads to Durin's hidden mithril mine. All out of genuine concern for his friend.
I care nothing for whatever is in that chamber. I do care for you, for this friendship, and secrets do not become it.
You came here because Celebrimbor suspected Durin was hiding something, you weaselly little shithead. Imagine spying on your friend and then barging into their house to berate them for being dishonest. That is some top-tier level gaslighting from Elrond. But because Durin is conveniently the biggest moron in Middle-earth, this lie ends up working, where he then, despite Elrond claiming that he has no interest in what is in the mine, proceeds to reveal the dwarves' discovery of a new ore, mithril. An incredibly rare mineral that is lighter than silk, stronger than iron, and dearer than gold. It could bring about a new age of prosperity for the dwarves, but the reason for its secrecy is that mithril is apparently perilous to mine. Though despite all of that, Durin gives a piece of this incredibly rare mineral to the person who broke into his secret mine as a token of their friendship. I can't imagine that Elrond would ever do something slimy like completely betray Durin's trust and the memory of his father within the very next episode.
I need your oath. You'll never breathe so much as a whisper of what I'm about to tell you to another living soul.
I swear on the memory of my father, Eärendil the Mariner. And this mithril. It is our only salvation.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
But shortly after this exchange, a massive cave-in happens, and everyone gets real sad about it. No one dies, but Durin's father predictably and reasonably orders the mine to be shut down. Now, as painful as this entire plotline has been, it is unfortunately not the end of it. However, we then jump back to the Queen Regent Muriel holding an audience with Brick. She informs her that Halbrand has assaulted a group of men in the previous episode, because I guess he forgot he wasn't playing Skyrim and didn't realize that he can't just steal other people's guild crests to forge metal in Númenor.
He is understandably quick to temper. His people are dying. His people? I believe the man you hold in your dungeons is no common brawler, but the lost heir in exile to the throne of the Southlands.
I'm no expert, but I don't think being heir to a kingdom that technically no longer exists is a valid defense for beating the shit out of people and taking their stuff. Especially while doing so in a completely different kingdom where he holds absolutely zero authority.
And I suppose Elendil here is a runic emperor.
Petty lord, actually.
Yeah, any hope I had of this show actually dedicating an ounce of time to Elendil or Isildur's characters was completely dashed after that bit. Two of the most prominent figures of the Second Age and descendants of the House of Fingolfin are turned into washed-up losers who get sidelined for the vast majority of this show. I would have preferred the writers to have just left them out of the season entirely, especially since neither one is even supposed to exist at this point in the timeline. Still, they will pop up occasionally throughout the review, but not enough to spend a considerable amount of time dissecting their characters. Anyways, after that jab at Elendil, Muriel turns down Brick's request to form an alliance to prevent the orcs from taking over the Southlands, and points out that Halbrand will have to face judgment for his crimes. This leaves her with no other options than to go behind Muriel's back and commission her request directly to the king. Her plan to go about accomplishing this is to openly challenge Muriel's authority and inform her that she's going behind her back.
Then I have little choice but to ask for another, one with Numenor's true ruler. Your father, the king. There is a tempest in me, and it will not be quelled by you, Regent.
Right, now I was actually about to commend the show for providing some form of obstacle and potential growth for Brick as a character, until I remembered that never at any point do either one of them ever actually have to face any ramifications for their respective actions in Numenor, let alone for this specific instance of Brick being incapable of not saying the quiet part out loud. During their time in jail, though, Not Sauron decides to give Brick some advice.
It seems to me that you do well to identify what it is that your opponent most fears.
And exploit it.
No, give them a means of mastering it, so that you can master them.
So Galadriel is effectively getting a masterclass on manipulation, and at no point does this conversation ever raise any red flags. I'm not suggesting that this would be a complete dead giveaway that Halbrand is Sauron, but you think at the very least it would warrant a concerning glance from Galadriel, though I will admit Brick's initial reaction to all of this advice is a bit suspect.
You do well to identify what it is that your opponent most fears.
And exploit it.
This is yet another example of the writers either painfully misunderstanding or maliciously twisting the dichotomy between good and evil because they effectively deluded themselves into believing they could out-Tolkien Tolkien. Characters that are supposed to be either the heartbeat of this story or morally good at their core are oftentimes opportunistic, deceitful, manipulative, controlling, arrogant, or vindictive. The fact that Galadriel came to this conclusion without any hesitation, and that she also views Muriel as an opponent rather than an ally, is a very telling and damning indictment of her character. I've gotten some pushback on the title of this series, claiming that it's hyperbolic or made in poor taste, but it was not made singularly in reference to the showrunner's comments. It was also done to highlight that characters that are intended to be the driving force for goodness, more often than not, display outright malicious or evil qualities. Patently so in certain cases.
We have each other. We're safe. That is how we survive. Take their wheels and leave them.
You know, Malva, it would be grand if you weren't right all the time.
At a certain point during their discussion, Not Sauron suggests to Brick that she's in the cell because she's unable to identify what the Queen most fears, where Brick then concludes that she was only thrown into a cell because she mentioned Muriel's father.
I asked her to fight for your people.
But that wasn't what provoked her anger, was it?
I demanded to speak with her father, the king in the tower, who no one has seen in years.
It can't possibly be because she threatened to kill the Queen Regent of Numenor, or because she threatened to kill a captain of the Sea Guard, or because she openly challenged Muriel's authority, or that all these reasons have culminated with her arrest. It has to be because Brick specifically brought up the king. It's actually pretty incredible how often Brick is rewarded for being the dumbest person in the room. The show has to actively go out of its way to claim that blatantly obvious reasons for her arrest couldn't have led to her arrest, also that Brick can reach the conclusion that the writers want her to. Which is rather ironic because she was still planning on going directly to the king well before she got locked up. If you were to cut this dialogue exchange out entirely, it would really change nothing with the plot. Moving on though, Pharazôn then arrives to deliver some important news.
Salutations, Elf! You are to be shipped back to the elves under armed escort tonight.
My brother in Christ, let me get this straight. You and Muriel initially refused to allow Brick passage on a boat to Middle-earth because, apparently, that hasn't happened in a while. even though just her sheer presence on your island has caused insane public unrest, having it be within your best interest to have her leave Numenor as soon as possible, where the both of you then spent 3 whole days deliberating, only to end up granting her passage on a boat to Middle-earth anyways. It's almost like the 3-day waiting period was established exclusively to have Galadriel end up changing her mind about leaving Numenor.
I know Kung Fu.
Show me.
So, setting aside that Brick somehow managed to beat the shit out of 5 Numenorian guards in hand-to-hand combat, even though all of them just voluntarily locked themselves in her cell, because that is an entirely new level of retarded in itself, there is also the glaring problem of Galadriel relying on brute impulse to achieve her end goals, despite having just taken in advice that maybe she shouldn't rely on brute impulse to achieve her end goals.
Has it ever occurred to you that you're not battling trolls or orcs, but men?
Are you really about to advise me in the art of war?
The show is almost entirely built upon broken dialogue that ends up effectively going nowhere, but this scene has to be one of the more staunch examples of it. Brick is immune to any form of character growth or development because, by virtue of her existence, she is always right. And once her Mary Sue powers activate, no one is able to stop her. Quite literally. After that absolute abortion of an action scene, Galadriel heads off to find the king in the old tower. So let's tally up all of her punishable crimes thus far. Multiple assassination threats made towards royal officials, assault, sedition, and now breaking and entering. Even if she managed to get the king's approval of this potential alliance, it's still very evident that Miriel is the one who holds actual authority, meaning that she should inevitably refuse to go to war and force Brick to answer for all of her respective crimes. But, like I pointed out earlier, cause and effect are very much non-factors in this show.
Apologies, Your Majesty, for the intrusion. But
Surprise, motherfucker!
How did you know I would come here?
The only way I can wrap my mind around how or why Galadriel would possibly be surprised to find the Queen Regent in her father's chambers is if she conveniently blacked out any memory of blatantly telling Miriel that she planned on going directly to the king to commission her request for a joint alliance against Sauron. Because if Miriel received news of Galadriel's escape, then her first reasonable guess as to where she might be headed would be towards her father's tower. Otherwise, what benefit would Galadriel stand to gain by escaping if she has no further interest in obtaining an army from Numenor? But naturally, this entire scene continues to spiral down into utter nonsense. The Queen Regent then reveals that a garrison is waiting down below to take Galadriel towards her ship, which is rather bizarre that they allowed her to scale this massive tower and neglected to post any guards in the actual room with Miriel. I mean, we are dealing with a person who's made multiple assassination threats against royal officials. However, after discovering that the king is a vegetable, Miriel, despite having absolutely no valid reason to do so, decides to reveal why her father was dethroned, and more importantly, her secret plant here. Whereupon touching it, Brick witnesses a vague premonition of the fall of Numenor.
There's a tempest in me!
Miriel claims that the vision initially begins with Galadriel's arrival to Numenor, and interprets all of this to mean that she needs to send her away to prevent her kingdom from falling into darkness. Now, discarding the 80 million different reasons how this entire sequence wildly contradicts canon, there's still the very pressing question of why in the hell Miriel, or even the king for that matter, didn't order to have the island evacuated after witnessing a vision of the utter apocalypse of their entire civilization.
Not a great plan.
And as she pointed out earlier, the core factor that effectively sets this prophecy into motion has already come to pass. Meaning that the end result is inevitable, and all they can hope to achieve at this point is saving as many people as they possibly can. However, let's entertain this rather insane notion that sending Galadriel away will definitely prevent this prophecy from stemming into fruition. It still doesn't explain why Miriel delayed sending her on a ship to Middle-earth for 3 whole days, if she genuinely believes her presence in Numenor will bring about its downfall. This scene is ultimately treated like it somehow suddenly explains all of Miriel's decisions and motivations to this point, but in all reality it is fundamentally broken. I'm left with far more questions than answers as to why she's chosen to deal with this situation this way. Though needless to say, Brick does an absolute piss-poor job to persuade her differently.
The virtue you speak of was your ancestors' loyalty to the elves.
My father believed that.
Except all of that is total bullshit. The virtue of the Númenóreans stems from their deeds and losses during the war against Morgoth, which is why they were gifted the Isle of Númenor by the Valar in the first place. And she would obviously have to be aware of this, because otherwise her persistence to get the Númenóreans to join her battle would sort of make no sense. Though if we are chunking Númenor's entire history out the window for adaptation's sake, having her incessantly screech about how elves are the best still isn't exactly the best sales pitch for Rick to whip out, when trying to convince an entire realm to take part in a conflict that she is clearly unequipped to deal with. But Muriel's decision is ultimately final and continues to go through with exiling Galadriel. Or, again, it would appear that way at first glance, because just as Brick is about to be shipped off, Muriel ends up changing her mind at the last minute and announces an important declaration towards her citizenry.
And so, I've decided to personally escort the elf back to Middle-earth to aid our mortal brethren, who are now besieged in the Southlands.
I really want to take a moment to highlight the leaps and bounds the script has had to take just to get to this point, because it is really rather insane. So the reason Galadriel was able to obtain a standing army for her war against Sauron is all because she jumped out of a boat, swam clear across the Great Sea, escaped getting eaten by a giant ocean worm, bumped into a raft that just so happened to be carrying the guy who may or may not be Sauron, where that raft was then spotted by Elendil's ship, which then took them all the way to Númenor, where the Queen Regent ultimately decided to okay Brick's alliance because she saw some petals fall from a tree that apparently is supposed to represent the tears of the Valar.
See, now that's some bullshit.
It's actually kind of strange that Muriel automatically interprets the petals falling to mean that she definitely should go to war, when in all reality it could very well mean a number of things. Maybe the Valar don't want Brick to go to war. Maybe this is a sign that she shouldn't allow her to leave the island. Or maybe the petals just naturally fell from the tree because that's just a thing trees do sometimes. Also, I have zero clue how Muriel plans on convincing an island that predominantly despises elves to go to war on an elf's behalf, especially considering that very same elf has committed an extensive litany of crimes within the very short amount of time she's been here.
Who is willing to commit themselves to our Queen Regent's protection?
Right, I have to remind myself on occasion that Rings of Power is not really a show, but rather an unholy amalgamation of places, characters, and events, just sort of tossed into the same pot with virtually no semblance or consideration for a through line whatsoever. All of the people that found Brick objectionable in the beginning arbitrarily come to respect and give her what she wants because the plot demands it. Not Sauron is effectively let off the hook despite having been caught red-handed because the plot demands it. These Númenóreans volunteer to enlist in a war in which they have no idea where or who it will be fought against because the plot demands it. And anything that is not immediately in service to the plot is effectively just chunked out the window because the payoffs need to happen, regardless of whether or not it absolutely shatters the narrative as a whole. And speaking of holes, we then cut away to Theo attempting to make his escape back to the Watchtower. He sneaks about halfway through the village until he is spotted and chased down by an orc. All hope seems lost until... Now, normally I would criticize the writer's use of a deus ex machina in order to prevent the orcs from getting their hands on the secret weapon they've been searching for, but, Anyways, following Theo's rescue, a Zack Snyder slow-mo chase sequence that ensues through the woods. And for some reason, there's also really somber music playing in the background, despite the fact that no one actually dies in this scene, and that a majority of it just consists of Arondir pulling off crazy elven feats of agility. That is, until the both of them stumble upon... Bronwyn? Insanely convenient that she just somehow managed to wander to their exact location in this vast forest with barely any daylight about. Not to mention that no one from the outpost could have been bothered to accompany her to offer some form of protection or backup. Really telling as to what these refugees think of their leader. But wouldn't you know it, our protags make it out into a clearing just as the sun is rising, allowing for their safe return. even though these orcs have the clothing or equipment to travel around in daylight unhindered, chase them all the way from the village to recover the secret weapon, and vastly outnumber the three of them.
Man, this is some bullshit!
However, upon their arrival back to Osterith, Arondir then relays Adar's message to Bronwyn.
I have a message from the one who commands our enemy, that your people may live, if you forsake all claim to these lands, and swear fealty to him.
And if we refuse?
He's coming for Osterith.
Now, this would actually be an effective means of setting the stakes and providing a grand conflict for these refugees to deal with, if it wasn't totally undermined by this.
If even one of us makes it home, we can return in force and sweep the enemy from these lands like salt from a table.
That's right, selective amnesia is back and in full force. Now, if the show is establishing this as fact, and not some bold-faced lie told by the Watch Warden to coordinate an escape attempt, then Arondir clearly would have the means of sending word that the orcs have invaded the Southlands and that they plan on taking Osterith. But he never at any point makes the effort to do this, because he just forgot.
Well, Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
Shut up! Will you shut up?
The next day, though, Bronwyn decides to address the crowd.
In exchange for mercy, we have been ordered to abandon this tower and swear fealty to their commander. But if you choose to stand with me and fight, this tower will no longer be a reminder of our frailty, but a symbol of our strength.
I say be better to take our chances bowing to the supposed enemy. I'll say this for our ancestors. They lived!
Or, I have a really crazy idea. They all can just leave. Middle-earth is a very big place. There are plenty of options to choose from. They can just go literally anywhere other than here. And if no one in Bronwyn's camp was on the fence about abandoning the Watchtower before any of this, they sure as shit should be now, considering half the group has left to go sell their souls to the person who they believe to be Sauron. Nor should we neglect that orcs, supposedly, either can't or are unwilling to travel around during the day, which would give the villagers a massive head start to gather their things and seek refuge elsewhere. And none of this is supported by the fact that the only one here seemingly with any actual combat experience is Arondir. I mean, sure, he can train them up to the best that he can within the very short amount of time that he has left, but that can really only stretch so far. Speaking of which, later that night, Arondir is teaching Theo how to shoot a bow.
And we're going to need another fight to come.
All my life your kind has watched us, counting every whisper, every kitchen knife too sharp. We're all about to be buried in this tower, so why be buried with us?
I've come to know the voices and the hands of those behind them.
So, just to translate all of that, he's really into Theo's mom, because that's really the only person from the village who he regularly talks to or spends any considerable amount of time with. The idea that he possesses a deeper understanding or respect for the Southlanders as a whole is straight up laughable, since he only holds their past above their heads constantly.
When are you people gonna let the past go?
Past is with us all, whether we like it or not. How familiar are you with the townsfolk of Holden?
I was born there.
The people of Holden were known for having been especially strong in their loyalty to Morgoth. Your people have worked an entire age to earn back their virtue.
This is the worst. This is the worst! You are the worst! I hate looking at your face. I want to smash it!
It's one thing to have him exposit his beliefs towards another character, but if those beliefs are completely out of sync with what we're shown of him on screen, then anything that's said in this exchange is kind of inconsequential. But for some reason, all of this resonates with Theo, where he then proceeds to reveal his secret Sauron sword.
I've seen this before. It is a key. Conjured by some forgotten craft of the enemy to enslave your ancestors.
Jesus H. Christ, that is an absolute fire hose of nonsense and exposition. So the sword was apparently designed as a key to enslave the Southlanders' ancestors, even though we've seen Theo use it multiple times without ever losing any semblance of his free will, and that this sword is actually used to transform the entire region of the Southlands into Mordor. More on that later. So, this effectively means that Arondir is either completely theorizing in the moment as to what it is this sword actually does, or the writers purely forgot about this scene and ended up tearing the continuity of their own fanfiction to shreds.
What made you mad enough to wanna...
Pure ignorance, sheer stupidity, and wild recklessness.
Though if we were to entertain this premise on face value, it still heavily recontextualizes the actions of the Southlanders' ancestors, because their devotion to Morgoth was not out of their own volition, and any moral judgments made of them or their descendants by the elves would be incredibly unfounded. And it's also established that the forging of the sword is a forgotten craft of the enemy, meaning that, theoretically, more of these swords exist in Middle-earth. So if the elves were to ever abandon Ostirith, that would leave the door wide open for someone to use one of these swords on this ritual site. The fact that the elves would even entertain abandoning this tower at all is pretty bizarre, and it's equally strange that during the centuries the elves have spent watching over the Southlands, that not a single one of them ever considered tearing down this ominous ritual site. However, Arondir knows that the orcs are searching for this sword, and he also knows that they are planning on taking Ostirith, which means that the most logical thing to do at this point is to get the sword as far away from Ostirith as humanly possible, and to spread the word that the orcs have invaded the Southlands. But the both of them proceed to have a struggle session as to what to do, because the show needs to have its bootleg Helm's Deep moment. Unfortunately, that topic is an absolute mountain of issues in itself, and if I'm to get this video out in a relatively timely manner, then I'll have to wrap things up here. But before closing off the video, I just want to take a quick moment to thank you all for all the support I've gotten on part 1. I legitimately didn't expect anybody to really watch this series, so it's definitely been a welcome surprise to say the least. Also, on a different note, my band Infall just recently dropped a new single, so if you're interested in checking it out, the link will be posted down below in the description. Either way, thanks for watching, and I will see you all in part 3.